How broken is Indiana Jones on Nintendo Switch 2? Is it broken at all? Is there any issues with it? Let's talk about it. And thanks to Bethesda for sending me a code. That was super epic. And yeah, thank you for that. That was very kind. And that is the version I'm playing today. In this video, I want to talk about the Switch 2 performance, the graphics, and the overall differences I've seen on the Switch 2 version of the game, and just my overall thoughts and opinions on the game. I primarily want to focus on the Nintendo Switch 2 specific features, things like graphics and performance. I'll be talking less about the game itself because the game's kind of been out for quite some time now, and you probably already have your opinion on the game if you've been interested in it at all. Now, I will still tell my opinion, but I'll make more of a deal about that later on, and I'll talk primarily about the Switch 2 features and all that stuff first, so that if you only care about that, then here we are. We're talking about that. This is another one of those games that doesn't really feel possible on the Switch 2 and is surprising that it's even here. But not only is it surprising how it's here, but it's just surprising how good of a port they made for the Nintendo Switch 2. There are a lot of games that have come out on the Switch 2 that have some very spotty ports, but recently we've been seeing some very, very high quality ports on the Switch 2 utilizing the Switch 2's hardware, and this is just another one of these examples that I can give. Some really good Switch 2 ports that we've seen are things like, Cyberpunk or Star Wars Outlaws. Those get mentioned a lot, but that's because they're so well, they're so good. They run very good on the Switch 2, especially for such a small portable device, and the same goes for this port here. There are some issues with it, which I will talk about, but overall, the experience on the Switch 2 is just very, very solid. So let's just get right into the specifics. It targets 1080p docked, not 4K or anything, which honestly is fine for such a graphically intensive game. It goes up to 1080p docked, 720p handheld, and it primarily does that by using the DLSS, the AI upscaling. I'll be honest, I don't exactly know how it works, but what I do know is that essentially it tricks the game into thinking that it's actually running at, let's just say 540p, which is just a random number I'm coming up with, and then an AI upscales. I think it's using AI. It's pretty much just upscaling the game to run at that 1080p, and I can't tell. I'm not a huge stickler with these high-end graphic upgrading and all that stuff, but the game looks really sharp, very, very sharp, especially on the TV. I played this mostly docked, but it's more than just the resolution that I think really stands out for this game. The lighting is one thing that I think completely makes this game feel very atmospheric, or has a kind of a very serious tone. It really is just the icing on the cake. The lighting is just so good in this game, and I really do think that it's carrying the graphics overall. And it's not even just the lighting. It's there's reflections on glass and water. There's also some visual effects like particle effects that really stand out and make this game feel like a modern current gen game. Facial animations and cutscenes look surprisingly high-end for this Nintendo hardware as well. The texture quality is pretty strong. You can definitely see that it's lacking in some ways, but I would say overall, the textures are definitely higher quality than what we would see on, say, a Switch 1 game, obviously. And I think because it's 1080p, that largely affects how the textures actually look on this game. And it's toned back, but they're still solid. They're good enough. Like, I would still say that this is one of the best looking games on Switch 2 so far, especially from a third-party developer. This is definitely a game that is pushing the Switch 2 to its limits. So visually and graphically, this looks very good. And I think that based on the gameplay that you're probably seeing here, you would have to agree that this is higher graphical fidelity than most other Switch 2 games right now. Now, let's talk about the performance, because this is kind of where it gets a little iffy on the Switch 2, and how it can feel buggy or glitchy, especially compared to other consoles. Now, I should say I actually haven't played this game on any other console, but just from looking at gameplay comparisons and all that stuff, I can kind of gauge on the comparisons there. But overall, I'm mainly talking about the Switch 2 version anyways, but the performance is where things get a little bit iffy. So it is mostly stable at 30 frames per second. It is targeting 60 frames per second. Everything, including the menus and UI, that is all running at 30 frames per second. Now, obviously 60 frames per second would have been nice, and I wonder if they could have even squeezed a performance mode. I mean, I know Resident Evil Requiem, that game looks fantastic as well, and they were able to get that to run at 60 frames per second. Not a super solid 60 frames per second, but mostly solid 60 frames per second. Here, this game obviously runs at 30 frames per second, as I mentioned, but there are a lot of frame rate chugs that I've noticed. It is not a solid 30 frames per second, but I'd say 90% of the time it hits it. Based on the amount of gameplay that I've actually played, it didn't feel super jarring in most of the gameplay, and you'd mainly see these drops during, big explosions, or if there's a bunch of enemies swarming you, you're fighting them, you just got the punching going on. And I also noticed that when there was a lot of foliage around, like the opening cutscene, there was quite a bit of frame rate dips. There actually was a bit of pop-in too, I didn't really mention that. At the very beginning section with all the foliage and you're pretty much like in this forest, there's quite a bit of lighting pop in and some shadows that were popping in. And that was a little bit jarring and that made me a little bit nervous at first, but that was really the only section that I played so far that had that bad pop in. But anyways, going back to the performance, I think the frame rate, it really is this game's or this version's biggest flaw. But if you can get past the 30 frames per second, this looks really good. This game is also very cinematic, so it actually kind of adds to that 30 frames per second. Like this feels like an Indiana Jones movie, and which I'll get back to a little bit later, but having that more cinematic frame rate, that 30 frames per second with that motion blur, really makes me forget that I'm playing a high intense video game. I'm not going to sit here and say that 30 frames per second is better than 60 frames per second, but I can see the argument being for 30 frames per second. And you know, I think that even if you had the option to play at 60 frames per second, I can see a lot of the movie fans, movie fanatics actually want to play in 30 frames per second because of how movie-like it feels in this lower frame rate. I haven't played enough of handheld mode to even tell if there's a difference with the frame rate, but my first impression in handheld mode was that it looks just as good as on the TV. I guess you can tell that it might seem a little bit sharper because of the smaller screen that I'm playing on, but overall it's largely the same. One thing that I really appreciate this game does is actually give you the option to change a lot of the graphical settings in the game. Well, I mean, a decent amount, I should say. It doesn't give you things like shading and shadows to adjust, and you know that would actually boost the performance, but it does allow you to change the subtitles, and you can do some visual things like the brightness, which I guess really isn't that important on a Switch 2 game, but it does, like, you can adjust the sharpness and a bunch of random things like that. I guess it feels more important than it actually is, and maybe I'm still Switch 1 brained where that was never even an option. But anyways, I'm happy to see some of these accessibility and graphics options because it was just a lot more than I expected, and I think it's worth mentioning. Now, the game itself is 58 gigabytes, 59, it's just under 60 gigabytes to download the game itself, which is a pretty big game. And I think that a lot of us would expect that because this is such a graphically intense game. Yes, of course, this is going to be a rather big install size. Now, if you don't want to install it, this is also one of the few full on the cartridge game releases on the physical cartridge. Anyways, if you like physical games like I do, I highly recommend that you buy a physical version. It just kind of tells, Nintendo and the game company and the Switch 2 people who make games that we want physical games. I'm not a big game keycard hater. I'll buy a game keycard over a digital version of the game if it's the same price. I've talked about this in previous videos, and I know a lot of people flame me for it, but I like game keycards because they have the same benefits of a regular physical cartridge. If I wanted to sell the game, I could still sell the game. If I wanted to lend the game to, my brother if he wanted to play it, I still can with a game keycard, and that makes it's just a lot more difficult to do that with a digital version. It's possible, but it just makes it more difficult and kind of annoying. Yes, there are flaws, whatever. This is not what we're talking about today. But anyways, the game is fully on the cartridge. You don't need to store the game on your actual Switch itself, which is a big reason why I'd wanted to play this version on the Switch 2, the physical version on the Switch 2. There are a lot of people that, say the full cartridge or the actual physical cartridge can run the game a little bit slower. Because they sent me a code, I can't actually test that, but that is something to be mindful of because the game would be running on a cartridge. We've seen that cartridge games might load slightly slower. Like with Mario Kart World, the cartridge game versus the digital game actually has slightly longer load times. So if that's something that bothers you, maybe consider getting the digital version. But I mean, it's not that big of a deal. I do have to say though, speaking of load times, I think the overall load times and just the way it runs on the Switch, just how fast it boots up, very impressive. I died several times while playing this game, and I was back in a couple of seconds. Like, I wasn't waiting long. Now I'll talk a little bit more about the game itself. I will cut back to and keep talking about the Switch 2 version of the game, but I will talk more about the game itself now. So first of all, Indiana Jones, for me, like, I haven't watched one of those movies in such a long time. I think I was a kid when I first watched the Indiana Jones movies, but oh my goodness, it's a nostalgia bomb going back to these Indiana Jones games. Like, obviously the movies were good, but I think the biggest impact on Indiana Jones for me was the Lego games. I loved the Lego Indiana Jones games. The first one more than the second one, but still, they made two Lego Indiana Jones games. Like, what even is that? Anyways, I liked Indiana Jones as a kid, and I watched the movies and I liked them all. And playing this game on Switch 2 was bringing me back, fully bringing me back. Like, this feels like Indiana Jones. The way that the characters talk to each other, the music especially was really, really classic feeling, like the Indiana Jones movies. It's got that, orchestral sound and that intense sound. The sarcastic humor throughout the whole game was very similar to Indiana Jones. So it really does capture that classic adventure movie vibe. Like, if you like Indiana Jones at all, if you love those movies back in the day, without a doubt, you'll like this one. It has a very strong cinematic presentation. And I really have no complaints with the story itself or how they played this out and interacted with the gameplay and stuff like that. I will say, if it wasn't an Indiana Jones games, I would say like there's probably quite a lot of cutscenes here, but because it's Indiana Jones, all of that works together. Now, okay, one specific thing about the Switch 2 version and the overall cutscenes is that you'll notice in between shots before it changes, and I don't know how this is on other consoles fully, but when it changes shots, it like flickers. It almost has a frame rate drop when it changes the cutscene, because these are all in-game rendered cutscenes. It will flicker or pause before it shows you the next scene. So that is a little bit annoying, especially because it's so cutscene heavy, but still, based on the overall graphics, it's easy to get past. It's easy to move on from. And at the very end of the video, by the way, I'll tell you if I would prefer the Switch 2 version over, say, a PS5 version or an Xbox One or Xbox Series or PC version. I'll tell you my opinion on that. Now, the gameplay of this game, I would say I'm a little bit less a fan of. This is played in fully the first-person perspective. It'll cut to third person when you're like climbing up your whip or going up a wall, but largely this is played in first person. I wasn't sure how I'd feel about this at first, but it fits surprisingly good. I can't say that I would prefer it being in first person, but it wasn't like bad. I think it feels slightly more janky though. Like, the combat itself is just, it's like really, it feels wacky. Like, when you're punching someone, it looks like you're punching someone. Like, I believe that I punched someone, but it feels really good when you slap that whip. Ooh, feels nice. Now, for me personally, I don't love love all of the puzzles. I would prefer to just kind of beeline. I really like linear stories, linear games. I like just trudging through it. And this game does have that quite a bit, but there's a lot more puzzle solving than I would like. Obviously, puzzles are a big part of the Indiana Jones brand and, movies and stuff like that. And it's not overbearing, especially if you like puzzles. But if you like a more linear story, then maybe you might get a little bit bored or annoyed with some of these puzzles. Now, there is a lot of easy mode options that you can turn on. If you don't like puzzles and you just want to breeze through the story, there are, tutorials you can turn on. Easy modes. Now, I didn't want to turn that on because I wanted the authentic experience, but I might turn them on. We'll see. We'll see how, if a puzzle gets really hard and I'm stumped, then maybe I will. But at least there's the option there. But overall, I think the Switch 2 has very impressive visuals on Indiana Jones. I love that you can play this portably and it feels just like the movie. The issues, it's 30 frames per second, and some people might not like that, but mostly that it dips 30 frames per second. That's probably the worst part about this version. That's this version's biggest flaw. And maybe they can patch that at some point. I wouldn't bet on it, but would I prefer to play this version over, say, the PS5 version? For me, yes, because I love playing these games portably. I think across the board, this is probably the best way to play the game portably. There are a lot more handheld PCs and stuff like that, but I truly believe that with the upscaling tech, this is the best on Switch 2 if you like it portably. One thing that I think a lot of people forget about these portable versions of games is the fact that when a company makes a Switch 2 game or ports over a Switch 2 game, they are trying to make the game run as best as possible for the specific hardware. When it's a PC game or you're playing on Steam on a handheld PC, it's a lot less fine-tuned. It's a lot less using its hardware for the game. And with the Switch 2, I truly believe they squeezed every ounce of the Switch 2's power to get it running as best as they possibly could. And it looks fantastic. Like I said, the resolution is sharp enough. The lighting is phenomenal. The effects are really good. And the reflections and all that stuff. It just makes this game really feel like a current gen console game on the Switch, on such a tiny little handheld console. So I would prefer to play this on handheld. I like the portable form factor and the fact that there's no major graphical differences or graphical flaws. That is definitely something worth noting if you have the option to play on both. Also, don't confuse that with me thinking that it looks better on the Switch 2. In no way do I think that this looks better on the Switch 2. It doesn't look better on the Switch 2, but I will definitely take the compromises of the graphics, of the performance, so that I can play it portably. And I think that really is the best part of the Switch 2. And that's always been the joy of the Nintendo Switch in general. But anyways, anyways, let me know what you think about this new Indiana Jones game. Tell me if you are interested in it at all, if you finally had the urge to pick this up and play it on the Switch 2, or if you've even played it on another console. Tell me what you think about the game. I'm curious to know. And would you agree with most of what I said? Thank you all for watching. Thanks again to Bethesda and Machine Games for sending me over a code, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Like and subscribe, do all that epic YouTube stuff. I'll talk to you in the next one. See you later.